In this episode, we connect a lot of the ideas you have been building into one practical challenge: getting development, security, and operations, DevSecOps, to actually stick as a day-to-day way of working. Many beginners hear DevSecOps and assume it is a tool set, a job title, or a trendy rebranding of security review, but the real point is simpler and harder at the same time. The point is to make security outcomes repeatable inside normal delivery rhythms, so security is not a last-minute scramble or an after-the-fact blame game. That only happens when controls are measurable, meaning you can tell whether they are being followed and whether they are producing the results you expect. It also only happens when ownership is shared, meaning security is not treated as something one team throws over a wall to another team when it becomes inconvenient. If you can learn to describe measurable controls and shared ownership clearly, you can spot the difference between real adoption and a slogan. A useful way to ground this topic is to define what adoption means, because the word can hide a lot of wishful thinking. Adoption is not a policy statement, a slide deck, or a training session that everyone forgets after a week. Adoption means that when software changes are planned and shipped, security expectations show up in those decisions without needing a hero to remember them every time. It means teams can answer simple questions reliably, like what risks were considered, what protections were built in, and what evidence exists that protections are working. Beginners often believe that if everyone agrees security is important, adoption will follow naturally. But agreement is not a process, and a process is what produces consistent outcomes. Adoption also means that security work is visible in the same place where delivery work is visible, because invisible security work is easy to skip when time pressure hits. When adoption is real, teams do not feel like security is a random interruption, because the controls are built into the flow of work. That is why measurable controls and shared ownership are not extra features of DevSecOps. They are the definition of whether it is real. Measurable controls are the first pillar, and a control is simply a condition you want to enforce to reduce risk in a predictable way. A control might involve how access is granted, how changes are reviewed, how sensitive data is handled, or how evidence is recorded when something goes wrong. The measurement part is what makes the control operational instead of aspirational, because measurement lets you see whether the control exists, whether it is being followed, and whether it is producing the intended effect. Beginners sometimes think measurement means counting how many issues you find, but that can reward noise and fear rather than improvement. A better mindset is to measure whether the control is present where it should be present and whether it is reducing the kind of failures it was designed to prevent. For example, if a control is meant to ensure risky changes are reviewed, the measurement is not how many reviews happened, but whether risky changes ever slip through without review. When you measure the control itself, you create a feedback loop that can improve reliability over time. Shared ownership is the second pillar, and it matters because security outcomes depend on decisions made by many roles, not just by one security team. If developers build features, operations teams run systems, and security teams define risk expectations, then security is a product of their combined behavior. Shared ownership does not mean everyone is equally responsible for everything, because that leads to confusion and finger-pointing. It means each group owns specific responsibilities that connect cleanly, so security is not a separate lane that work can ignore. Beginners sometimes assume shared ownership means security teams lose authority, but what really happens in mature organizations is that security teams shift from being gatekeepers to being designers of controls and partners in solving systemic problems. Developers own building secure behavior into code paths, operations owns running environments safely, and security owns defining risk boundaries and validating that controls work. When ownership is shared, people can disagree constructively about trade-offs, because the roles are clear and the goal is the same. This is also how you reduce friction, because teams are not forced into last-minute conflicts about who should have done something earlier. To drive adoption, you need to understand why security often fails to embed in delivery even when everyone is well-intentioned. One reason is that security requirements are sometimes expressed as vague goals, which makes them hard to act on and easy to postpone. Another reason is that security work is frequently introduced as a separate workflow, so it competes with delivery work instead of being part of delivery work. Time pressure amplifies both problems, because when deadlines approach, people choose the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance is whatever feels optional. A third reason is the absence of trustworthy feedback, because if teams cannot quickly tell whether they are meeting expectations, they cannot adjust without slowing down. Beginners may think the solution is to demand more compliance, but compliance without integration tends to create theater, where people check boxes while the underlying risk remains. Adoption improves when the secure path is easier than the insecure path, and measurement plus shared ownership are how you make that true. When you design controls that fit the workflow and assign ownership that matches how work actually happens, adoption becomes the default behavior. A practical way to make controls measurable is to define them as observable outcomes rather than as personal intentions. Instead of saying developers should be careful, define a control such as changes that affect authentication must be reviewed by someone trained to recognize access control risks. Then define what evidence proves the control is happening, such as a consistent record that review occurred and that key security questions were addressed. Beginners should notice that this framing avoids judging people's motives, because it focuses on whether the process produced the expected safety check. Another example is defining a control that sensitive data must not appear in logs, and measuring it by checking whether logging output contains prohibited patterns. The important point is that measurable controls create a clear pass or fail signal that does not depend on a manager's opinion. That signal should be available early in the workflow, because finding out late means rework, and rework is what makes security feel slow. Measurable controls also make conversations easier, because teams can discuss what the control should be and what the measurement should look like, instead of arguing about whether someone tried hard enough. Over time, these controls become guardrails that prevent common failures. Measurable does not mean complicated, and beginners should be careful not to confuse sophisticated measurement with useful measurement. A control can be measured with a simple yes or no question if it is designed well, such as whether a required review happened for a high-risk change. Another control might be measured as a rate over time, such as how often emergency fixes are needed for avoidable security issues, because a decreasing rate suggests the process is improving. The goal is not to generate endless metrics, but to choose a small set that reflects real quality outcomes and cannot be easily gamed. This is where teams often go wrong by counting activities like number of tickets closed, because activity is easy to inflate without improving security. Useful measurement also includes trend awareness, because you want to know whether risk is rising or falling, not just what happened in 1 week. If measurement creates fear, people will hide problems, and hidden problems do not get fixed. If measurement creates clarity, people can focus on improving the system. DevSecOps adoption becomes much easier when measurement feels like a flashlight rather than a weapon. Shared ownership becomes real when responsibilities are explicitly mapped to decisions, because decisions are where security outcomes are created. Developers make decisions about input handling, access checks, and data flows, so they must own implementing secure patterns and fixing issues close to the code. Operations teams make decisions about deployment, configuration, and monitoring, so they must own running environments with stable guardrails and reliable visibility. Security teams make decisions about acceptable risk, baseline requirements, and verification, so they must own defining controls that are realistic and validating that controls work in practice. Beginners sometimes imagine these responsibilities overlap in messy ways, but good design reduces overlap by making interfaces clear, such as security defines the expectation, developers build it into the product, and operations ensures it stays true in the running environment. Shared ownership also means shared success criteria, so the teams are not optimizing against conflicting goals like ship fast versus be safe. When success criteria are shared, conversations become about trade-offs and priorities rather than about blame. That is the heart of DevSecOps, because security becomes a team outcome, not a separate team's burden. One of the most effective accelerators of adoption is to treat controls as product features of the delivery system, not as special favors requested by security. If a workflow requires a review step for certain high-risk changes, that step should be part of the normal path, not an exception that depends on someone remembering to ask. If certain baselines must be met, Those baselines should be checked automatically as part of the path to release, so the same standard applies every time. Beginners should notice that this approach reduces arguments, because the process enforces the standard consistently instead of relying on negotiation. It also reduces burnout, because security staff do not have to chase every team and developers do not have to guess what is expected. When controls are built into the delivery path, teams can plan around them, which reduces the feeling that security is unpredictable. The controls also become teachable, because new team members can learn the standard by following the workflow. This is a major reason measurable controls matter, because if a control cannot be observed, it cannot be reliably enforced in a workflow. The result is a delivery system that produces safer outputs by default, which is exactly what adoption is supposed to mean. Another essential idea is that adoption improves when feedback is fast and specific, because slow feedback is experienced as punishment rather than guidance. If a team learns a security expectation was missed only at the end of a release cycle, the fix is costly and stressful, and people remember the stress, not the lesson. If the team learns early, the fix is smaller, and people can absorb the lesson as part of normal work. Fast feedback also builds trust in controls, because teams see that the controls are catching real issues consistently rather than randomly causing friction. Specific feedback matters because vague messages create confusion and rework, while specific messages help people correct the problem quickly and learn the underlying pattern. Beginners should recognize that fast and specific feedback is a delivery concept as much as it is a security concept, because it improves quality without slowing pace. This is also where shared ownership shows up again, because feedback must reach the person who can act on it, and the person who can act depends on what type of decision was involved. When feedback loops match ownership, fixes happen quickly and learning becomes cumulative instead of repetitive. A common beginner misunderstanding is that DevSecOps is mainly about adding security tests, but tests alone do not create adoption if the organization cannot handle the results. If tests produce endless findings that teams cannot prioritize, the workflow becomes noisy and people learn to ignore it. If tests are treated as gatekeeping without a clear strategy, teams rush to bypass them, and bypassing is the opposite of adoption. Real adoption includes an approach to triage and prioritization that aligns with risk, so teams address the most important issues first and build momentum. It also includes clarity about when to stop a release and when to continue with a plan, because every organization faces deadlines, and pretending deadlines do not exist leads to hidden risk. Shared ownership is critical here, because security should not be the only voice deciding what is acceptable, and delivery should not be the only voice deciding what is urgent. When the decision is shared and the criteria are clear, teams can move forward without chaos. Adoption is not achieved by creating pressure, but by creating a system that makes the right decisions easier than the wrong decisions. Sustained adoption also depends on addressing incentives and culture in a practical way, because teams repeat what is rewarded. If teams are rewarded only for speed, they will treat security as a tax and look for shortcuts. If teams are rewarded only for avoiding risk, they may slow down in ways that harm the business and create resentment. A healthier approach rewards outcomes like fewer repeated security issues, faster recovery from mistakes, and steady improvement in control coverage. Beginners should notice that this kind of reward structure encourages learning and prevention rather than heroics. Shared ownership helps culture because it reduces the idea that security is someone else's problem, but culture only changes when behaviors are reinforced repeatedly. This is why measurable controls matter again, because measurement turns abstract values into visible progress. When teams can see that controls are improving and incidents are becoming less frequent or less severe, motivation increases. When teams cannot see progress, security work feels endless and arbitrary. DevSecOps adoption is partly technical, but it is also deeply human, because it requires people to trust the system they are being asked to follow. As organizations mature, the most successful programs treat control design as an ongoing improvement loop rather than a one-time rollout. A control that seemed reasonable at first may be too strict, too noisy, or too easy to bypass. And that is not a failure, it is information. Teams can refine controls by observing where friction occurs, where exceptions are requested, and where incidents still happen despite the control. Beginners should understand that refinement is not about weakening security. It is about strengthening reliability by aligning controls with real workflows. Shared ownership makes refinement possible because developers and operations can explain what actually happens in practice, while security can explain the risk boundaries that must still be respected. Over time, controls become simpler and more effective because the organization learns which checks catch meaningful problems and which checks produce noise. This is how you avoid the trap of building a heavy security process that slows everything down. Instead, you build a lean set of high-value controls that teams trust. Adoption grows when the system listens and improves, because people support what they believe is fair, useful, and grounded in reality. When you put it all together, driving DevSecOps adoption is about building a delivery environment where security is measurable, repeatable, and owned by the teams that make the decisions that create risk. Measurable controls translate security expectations into observable checks that can be integrated into normal workflows and improved over time. Shared ownership assigns responsibilities in a way that matches real work, so developers, operations, and security each own the decisions and outcomes that belong to them without dumping problems on each other. Fast, specific feedback loops keep learning early and rework small, which protects delivery speed while improving safety. A focus on outcomes rather than ticket volume prevents theater and encourages real improvement, while a culture of refinement keeps controls aligned with reality as systems and teams evolve. For a beginner, the most important takeaway is that DevSecOps is not a slogan you adopt. It is a system you build, and systems only work when you can measure them and when everyone involved shares responsibility for the results. When those two pillars are in place, security becomes part of shipping, not a barrier to shipping, and that is the moment adoption becomes real.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.